Hello Year 9, welcome to Lesson H, Plant Diseases. This is now moving onto, as I'm sure you've worked out, onto the plant side of organisms and infections. So your quick quiz here is getting you to look back at a couple of things we've done so far. So same as always, give yourselves about 6 or so minutes on this quiz. Answer as many as you can. So when you unpause the slide, then we'll go through the answers together. Okay, so going through the answers, which outer layer of leaves is the physical barrier to plant pathogens? That's called the cuticle. I'd also allow you have the epidermis on that one. Name the physical barrier that all plant cells have to pathogens. So that would be the cell wall. Remember, it also gives structure to the cells, but we're going to focus on barriers today. Name one chemical defense that plants use against pests or pathogens. So anything like poisons, stings, repellents. You wouldn't be able to have the physical ones such as bark or thorns. Which disease is a plant substance artemisinin used to treat? So this is from last lesson, if you remember it. It is of course malaria. Been used in herbal medicines for much longer than it has in medicinal ones. Or medical ones, sorry. Name one symptom of a disease that medicine aspirin is used to relieve. So there's a few, but things like it will reduce fever, it will soothe aches and pains. It's generally just a painkiller. It does also act as a blood thinner and reduces blood pressure as well. Which term describes methods used to kill microorganisms on equipment before carrying out experiments with bacteria, fungi or cells? It is of course the aseptic techniques. We looked at 2 of those last lesson. This is going to be asking you to look at them now. Which piece of equipment could be used to kill the microorganisms on glassware or in the growth media? So the agar gel you'd be using to grow it. It's of course the autoclave. And describe one way you could keep unwanted microorganisms out of a petri dish and culture vials during an experiment. Best thing to do there is keep it simple, put a lid on it. What is a physical symptom of Cholera ash dieback disease? So lesions, so remember those cracks or damaged areas on the bark, but also dieback on the crown, so at the top of the tree. And apart from disease, what else could cause a plant's leaves to go yellow? So there are lots of things. Anything that kind of just makes logical sense. So lack of water, too much heat, not enough heat, essentially any physical property of the area. Right, let's move on. Your learning objectives, so I'll let you go through those at your own pace, so feel free to pause it if you need to. Okay, you now have obviously your keywords. Obviously, we talked about lesion last lesson, but now the definition for lesions come up. Distribution analysis is kind of continuing on from the second half of last lesson. You might already know diagnosis, particularly if you watch any kind of medical dramas or anything like that. And then yield crops, we've talked about quite a few times in the past. So please do make a note of those into your books and abbreviate definitions and meanings where you can. When you're ready, unpause it and move on. So, quick recap from last lesson. We've obviously got that text information in red at the bottom there. I'll let you read through at your own pace. We have looked at that already. And then these 3 questions, you might recognise them. They are similar to the ones we used last lesson. And then when you're ready, we will move on to the next slide. So into your, no, let's go for whiteboards or scrap paper for this one. No need to record this one officially. Have a go answering those 3 questions. When you are ready, please do unpause it and move on. So, answers to 3 questions. 2 reasons why a gardener may be worried about aphids on plants. So they're pests, first off. They cause damage purely just by surviving on the plants. And they also may be vectors of pathogens such as viruses. How do wild potatoes protect itself? Hopefully you remember this one. They produce the alarm chemicals. So whenever they are attacked, they produce those chemicals which trick aphids into thinking they're being attacked, and obviously they fly away. And one advantage of potatoes only producing the substance when it's attacked, it all comes down to reserving energy resources. There's no need to produce it if you're not being attacked. So let's move on. Right, all these plants have something in common. What do you think it is? No need to write anything down, just have a little look at it. What do they all have in common? When you're ready, unpause it and move on. So, they are all problems with tomato plants. Each of these 5 images here represents a particular problem that might associate with a tomato plant. Have a think about what they are. We will come on to more detail on these in just a bit. If you want to make a brief note of these as we go, that's probably not a bad shout. So starting with top left and working our way around, we've got just general bad leaf growth in this one here. So you can see the leaves are starting to curl around. There could be many causes of that. Got my animations wrong. We have infection spots. So these are different to insect or pest attack points. These are infection points. They tend to be identifiable by a change of colour as opposed to just simply turning black and dying. Next up we have aphid infestation. Those lovely little red dots are all little aphids having a lovely delicious meal by the looks of it. Then moving across, deficiencies in the soil. So same with humans, if we have different deficiencies, we have deficiency diseases. Same goes to plants. If they are deficient in certain minerals, then they will also undergo deficiency diseases. And the last one is what happens when you spray something with chemicals. You don't like it. So, little summary point, what do you think are pests or pathogens, and which do you think are environmental? So how would you go about working out which is which? No right or wrong answer for that at this point, just a little thought for you to have in your head. When you're ready, unpause it and move on. So, obviously we talked about on the last slide the problems that associate the symptoms of problems that might affect a particular type of plant, in this case the tomato plants. But it's very important to know the difference between environmental problems and pathogen problems. While they might present very, very similarly, if you do not treat them differently, then you will essentially possibly cost yourself an entire year's worth of crop and lose yourself a huge amount of money. So for farmers, it's very important they can diagnose these problems, they can work out what these problems are, and control them. So can you please make a note there of the information in bold? So both pathogens and environmental factors must be controlled by the farmer to ensure large yields of crops. Identifying these stress causes, so these images here, is vitally important to prevent their loss of yield. It all comes down to money at the end of the day. If these infections are allowed to spread, or if environmental changes are allowed to continue, then you will lose huge amounts of crops. Right, when you're ready, unpause it and move on. So, plants do get poorly. They are living things. Every living thing can become infected by something, by a pathogen, and every living thing requires nutrition, and lacking nutrition causes deficiencies, which again can cause diseases. So plants, although can't vocalize their problems, they are still alive and they do still get ill. So, a lot of information on this slide. Please take your time to go through it. When we talk about plant illnesses and plant disease and plant infection, we tend to talk about stress factors. So plants don't necessarily show, can't, like I said, verbalize or express their symptoms, but they do show signs of stress of themselves trying to cope with it. These are their visible symptoms and physical symptoms, and these are used as part of the diagnosis process. So the main ones are the things that will cause the stress, as we've mentioned before, are things like poor growth conditions, too much or too little water, soil lacking nutrients, attacking by pests. There are many more. Those are the main 4. Most of the time it will be combination factors. So too much or too little water will often cause soil to lack nutrition as well, as it will get washed away, or the plants won't be able to absorb it without the water there. Or being attacked by pests will often be associated with water levels as well. Pests often travel with water. So please do make a note of those stress signs down the side, because we will be using those as part of a diagnostic tool later on. So let's move on. When you're ready, unpause it. So the physical visible symptoms, these are the stress identifying factors. We've already briefly talked about them before, but now I'd like to actually make a note of them into your books. We've obviously got our 5 pictures there, each one representing a different stress factor. So first one, changes in growth. If a plant stops growing as much as it is expected to, odds are it is because there is some sort of stress factor involved. Blotching of leaves, if there's not meant to be blotching, obviously some leaves do blotch. They are meant to blotch as part of the plant's kind of identifying feature. If it's not meant to blotch, probably not a good thing. It's another physical symptom. Lesions, as we mentioned several times before, so these are areas of damage. Might be caused by pests, but might also be caused by deficiencies or just general infection. Changes in the shape, so leaves that don't develop in the correct manner, maybe only half develop, or as you can see in the picture there, kind of split down the center, is another stress factor. Last one, a bit trickier, is changes in its function. If the plant does not function as it should, odds are it's a stress factor. So something like a potato plant that stops producing potatoes. Potatoes are basically stores of energy under the ground. If they aren't storing their energy, it means they're using their energy to fight off a pathogen or fight off a stress factor, and so its function as a plant is changing. So please do make a note of these summary points. When you're ready, please move on. So, chance for you to apply what you know. 2 questions. There's a picture there on the right hand side. Please, into your books, have a shot of both these questions. Please do not take any longer than 2 minutes per question. So if you can, time yourself. If you can't, don't, I guess, I don't know. So we will go through the answer on the next slide, but please pause it, give yourself 2 minutes for both of these. That's about 4 in total. Answer them and then unpause it when you're ready. So, answers. Describe the physical symptoms of damage in photo B. It looks like blotches. You might say that it's lesions. You might say that it's been attacked by a pest. That would probably be a bit too much information because you don't have necessarily any proof of the pest attack there. But you do know that they are not natural colours to go with the leaf, and so are probably lesions of some description. Explain why the visible symptoms are not enough to identify the cause of the damage. As I said before, we don't know if it's caused by pest, if it's caused by various other factors. So there's not enough information there to fully diagnose the problem. When you're ready, move on please. Unpause it, whatever. Right, moving on to distribution analysis. Sounds fancy, really isn't. Distribution analysis, all it's looking at, all it means is to look at where something is happening and analyze it. So where is damage in plants occurring? Is it occurring across just the left-hand side of every plant? Is it the north side of every plant? Is it only happening to certain plants in certain areas? Is it happening to all plants evenly? It's about knowing where the damage is happening and what the damage is. The reason being is that symptoms for different problems can look very, very similar. And if you're not sure, as you can see there in the red box, tests need to be done in a lab to identify the problems. So for example, drought and flooding both look very, very similar. As well as you can see there in the blue box, lack of certain nutrients as well will all cause similar effects to plants. Without being able to do the full analysis of the distribution factors, you won't be able to identify the causing factor. Please do make detailed notes from this slide, partly because it's important, but also partly because it's linked to our definition at the beginning of the lesson, although now it's in a bit more detail and actually been applied. So pause it and unpause it when you're ready to move on. Right, little question for you. This is quite a nice one because it links plant infections and plant kind of epidemics, so the spreading of disease, and it actually has some quite nice correlations to when we studied the cholera ones back with John Snow a few lessons ago. So looking at the question in the yellow box, how do you think the diagram will look if the damage is caused by a fungal disease spread by spores? So spores, remember, are released into the air, they travel by air, so they are an airborne infection. How would that affect how the disease spreads? So you can see there, the first box that's available to you at the moment is showing that if it's a pest, it's most likely caused by an epicenter, a bit like on the cholera map, where the water hydrant was the kind of center of the infection, and it spread relatively evenly out from that single point, the first infection point. How would this look different if it was to be done by wind rather than by pests? So have a sketch onto your whiteboard. If you've got your whiteboard, scrap bit of paper, back of your book, whatever, and unpause it when you're ready to see the answer. So as you can see, because the spreading factor is airborne, it literally travels with the wind. So plants very close to it on the wind side become infected, and then gradually as the wind spreads it spreads out with it. If it was a weaker breeze, it would be a wider spread. If it's a stronger breeze, it would be a thinner spread. And as you get further away, same as the other one, the infections get further apart as well. Well done if you got that right. Oh yeah, there's the answer. Okay, moving on to the last little bit now. So, as we talked about before with distribution analysis, you might have to send something off to a lab. If you send something off to a lab, then they're likely to do one of three things, although more likely they like to do all three of those. So they might try and grow the pathogen from a damaged crop. So they might take samples from a damaged crop and then try and grow those using aseptic techniques. They might be able to use technology and actually do a full gene sequence analysis and find particular genetic material from pathogens and identify it using genetics. Or they might run simple nutrition tests or toxin tests from the soil. These can be done very, very easily and don't require aseptic techniques for them. Please do make a note of those three. They crop up in the worksheet that's attached to this lesson. And then finally, sometimes to get the definitive identification of crop disease, they must send samples to testing. So when they're sent in, the report of observations will be included. So although they'll send the physical plant in or parts of the plant in, they'll also send images of where the plant is and how it's been affected. Right, when you're ready, unpause it and move on. Right, final part. So I've summarized everything that we've pretty much talked about so far, along with, as you can see down there, possible treatments of how you might overcome some of these problems. So things like our causes are on the top left there. Top right, we've got those three diagnostic tests we talked about, and at the bottom there we've got possible treatments. I would recommend, if you haven't picked up these points throughout the lesson, that you put them in now. You will need these moving forwards. When you're ready, have a shot at worksheet SB 5H.1, so it's the first worksheet. These will help you with that, and when you're finished on the worksheet, come back to the video, unpause it for your final summary question. So your summary question, S1 and E1, pick one, I don't mind which. You don't need to do both unless you're feeling really fancy, and then you can have a shot at both. And answer this into your book, please. So the last two questions: a farmer sends a sample of diseased plant and the sample of the soil it grew into the lab. Describe one test they might carry out on each of the samples to find out what caused the disease. So that's from a couple slides previous. Or as an extension, the farmer finds black spots on the leaves of his crop. Describe how the cause of the black spots could be identified. So they're both asking very similar things, just in slightly different ways. So give yourself a few minutes, answer one of those two, and then unpause the video for the answer. So I've accidentally put S1 twice. The first answer: attempt to grow the pathogen in small samples taken from the plant. Try to determine the genetic sequence of the plants or analyze the soil samples for different levels of toxins. So pretty much those 3 summary points from the last slide. And this one, E1, is very, very similar. He could set some different pest traps to determine if it is effective for pest presence in the crops. So that means he wouldn't have to send off for testing. That'd be a cheaper initial option, although he could then take samples if he couldn't determine the cause that way. Right. Very, very well done today. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. It's been an absolute rip-roarer of a lesson for me. I've loved every minute. Please do have a shot at the worksheet if you haven't done so now. They are very, very good summary worksheets and well worth a go at. Right. Have a lovely rest of your day. Toodaloo.